I guess what I would say that it represents the alternative. Yeah, Hello, is everybody there? Anybody there? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. It's just another minute because Stephen, didn't you tell me you couldn't make it today?
No, I'm not going to be able to make it for Friday's class.
Oh, it's Friday's class.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're all together again, and we'll resume. But before we do so, I'd like to introduce uh, Celeste Petrick from the History Department, the History Club of the Department of History, and she wants to talk for a few minutes about the activities of this group. So Celeste, will you speak?
Hi, guys. Thanks for listening. I'm Celeste. I'm the Vice President of the University of Manitoba History Students Association, HISA. Professor Heller, I have a presentation. If you would like to make me a co-host, then I could share it.
I beg your pardon. I'm not that. I don't know how to do that. So
okay. That's totally fine. Then I can just talk through. This is an upper years course, so I hope some of you are already familiar with the association from your previous years. But we have completely rebranded and repositioned ourselves this semester to fit the virtual learning experience that we're all in. We have created a website, and I'll share it here in the group for everyone. www.umhisa.com. It's going to be our new website where we're going to be hosting all of our functions and features for all the students. We're going to be posting all of the history scholarships that are available to all the students and for the specific courses that they're in. We also have a new podcast that we've started. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts. I will also put a link in the chat here. Hold on. We have 3 podcast episodes so far. Our first one was with Professor Heller and myself, where we discussed Marxist and capitalist theories. The second one was with Hannah Bellick, our Secretary of Events, and Rosine Kossar, and they discussed virtual learning. And then our third podcast has been with myself and instructor George Beery, where we discussed why history is important to learn. We're going to be releasing podcast episodes twice a month, where they're going to be either with professors, other students, or industry professionals that have history degrees or are working within the historical fields. We also are hosting a bunch of events that are going to be coming up this semester. We have one that's scheduled for this week. I'll put the link to the event Bright tickets here so you guys can grab your tickets. Let me just grab it here. It's going to be a historical bingo night where we'll be asking questions as if it'd be trivia, but then instead of you answering the questions, you mark down on your bingo sheet which answer it is. This event is supposed to be our initial back to school event. We're really excited for it. We have already 28 people signed up to play, so if you want to play, join in. Professor Heller, you're welcome to play as well.
I can play.
We have other faculty members that are going to be playing. But this event also is going to be, one second, I'm just going to post this in the chat here. We have a door prize event for this, or we have door prizes for this event. So anyone that attends will be entered into this door prize. And then for the winner, we have a package that is going to be donated from Tommy's on Corden, the pizzeria place. It's going to be a dinner for 4. You're going to get pizzas, pastas, salad, wine, drinks for 4 people. It's going to be awesome. We're so excited that they are donating that. We also, this year, it's different for the associations. You need to re-enroll as members. So if you were a member of the University of Manitoba History Students Association in the past, you're going to need to re-register as a member. I'll also put the link to that in here. With that, we are doing a giveaway for all of the new members. So even if you were a member in the past, you'll be considered a new member this year. We're giving away 2 Jets tickets to the Winnipeg Jets game on September 29th. If you register before September 24th, and then we'll announce the winner on our social pages and the website on the 25th. But yeah, like it's a really great initiative. It's a free membership that you get, and then you're going to get all of the access to all of the events that we're going to be hosting, all the information that we're going to be posting. As a member, you'll get first access to that through emails. And just to go through on our website, I don't know if anyone has it pulled up, but there's a lot of interactive functions on our website. You can go into student services, and then if you are still needing help with your writing or academics, then you can click on the Our Services tab. And then if you click on the writing actual word that says writing, it'll take you right to the academic writing resources that you can do. And then academics will be academic tutors. If you are needing that for any of your history classes or any other classes, it'll be in there. We'll also be posting job opportunities that we get told of by communities or within the university community. We just posted a job posting for the Mennonite Heritage Village in Steinbach, where they were looking for recent grads. So if you know anyone that had just graduated, they're looking for someone to help them in their historical curation process there. Also on the website will be all the events as well. So if you lose the web or the link that I posted in this chat, it's also on the website. And then we also have a new blog function where members from our executive team are going to be writing blogs every month for students, either about their student experience from like an executive writing about their experience in school, or about different topics that they're studying and researching. Just anything that's related to history, we are going to be putting through there. Other than that, I've covered everything that we have been doing and working on over the summer. If there's any questions, let me know, guys. If you want to be a part of any of the podcasts or you want to write a blog, you can also go on the website and then email any of the execs and let them know that you want to be involved. But other than that, that's my presentation for you guys. Does anyone have questions?
Celeste, thank you so much. This is excellent, and I would urge everybody to sort of link up with the History Club, because socializing is important, and particularly if you're doing history, this is a way of connecting, and all sorts of possibilities, intellectual, social, can become available this way. And I congratulate you, Celeste, for doing all this. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your class, guys, and semester.
Thank you. So today, is there any matter that arises from the last presentation that you want to bring up at this point, or any features of the syllabus? It's basically 4 pieces of work, as I explained: the introductory, the film, discussing French colonialism, then the term test, 2 out of 3 on the review questions, which I'm going to go over, then the paper based on the 4 books, and finally the final exam, 3 out of 9 take home, based again on the review questions, which I'm going to go over. So that's basically the setup. Okay, I'm going to move on if that's all right. So we left off, and we were we're really dealing with the first review question, basically the geopolitical context of the Vietnam War. And you'll recall that we did say, yes, the crusade against communism was certainly a part of this. Defending the free world from communism was certainly a motive for the Americans to become involved. And of course, this was a worldwide thing. But the second point I made, that underlying this is the fact that the United States had developed a huge interest in Asia, in East Asia, really starting in the 19th century, you can say, but especially in the 20th century. In the 19th century, the American merchants had become involved in the China trade. The American Admiral Perry forced the Japanese to open up commercially to the United States and the European powers. And then in 1898, there was a Spanish-American War, and the Americans seized the Philippine Islands, which became, and still is, the key naval and now air base for the United States in the Pacific. And then following World War I, the major rival, the others, the British, the French, and so on, became secondary. And the struggle for influence in Asia reduced itself to the struggle between Japan and the United States. The United States emerged victorious in 1945. Japan became a satellite of the United States, which it still is. So that's the second war for American influence in Asia. And then you have the Korean War. Following the Chinese Revolution, the Korean War broke out 50 to 53, and that was a war that ended in a draw. The United States had retained its influence in Asia. And finally, the last of these wars was the Vietnam War. It was a war basically, again, to contain China and to ensure American influence. And I would say that it was, although the Americans were defeated, they did, as you'll see, they did retain their influence in East Asia. A deal was struck, and the Americans retained their influence. In the first place, they were not deserted by their allies. The Japanese remained part of the American orbit. So did, as a matter of fact, Thailand, and certainly New Zealand and Australia, the Philippines, and indeed the United States actually acquired yet another ally when in 1965, the CIA arranged the overthrow of the neutralist government of Indonesia, this vast country, 120 million people spread out over many, many islands, had been up to that point pursuing a neutral position, neither for the East and the West. And this was partly the result of the fact that the Indonesian Communist Party, over 1 million members, was very influential in Indonesian politics. Well, in '65, there was a military coup with the help of the CIA, and the communists literally were wiped out physically in this coup. And Indonesia became an American ally and remains so to this day. So I would say that the Americans retained all of these allies in Asia, allies and of course bases in offshore from China as a result of the events of the Vietnam War. the second thing was a deal with China. Nixon and Mao met in 1971, I believe it was. They established diplomatic relations and, in fact, economic relations. And the United States was losing the war in Vietnam, but based on the deal between China and the United States in 71, it didn't seem to matter that much because the Chinese now established diplomatic relations with the United States. They, on the basis of that, the Americans dropped their embargo, their economic embargo against China, and this key relationship, economic relationship between China and the United States began from this point onwards. And it proved to be extremely profitable, both for the Chinese and for the Americans. As you probably know, this is the basis, this became the basis for world trade right up to the present. So what I say is this was a very clever move. And not only was it clever in that sense, but this political agreement and economic agreement also amounted to an American-Chinese alliance against the Soviet Union. This is all Kissinger, the famous Henry Kissinger. And it was an incredible diplomatic breakthrough for the United States. The split between the Soviet Union and China was consummated. China stood with the United States against the Soviet Union, it seemed. And so this was a fantastic victory in that sense. However, of course, all of this has come to an end because the United States' aim was basically to integrate China into the world capitalist system, which the United States controlled. But since about 2011, there has been a growing split. And under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has moved leftward, reasserted its socialist principles, and the United States is furious. And the present conflict, of course, that we read about on a daily basis, stems from about 2011 when Xi Jinping took power. Is there any question about what I've said? So this is a brief précis of the geopolitics. It starts out with containment of China, then there's a rapprochement, and finally we see now there's been this reassertion of the conflict between a socialist China, and my view is that China is a socialist country, despite the very important presence of capitalism within it. The state structure, the party structure, basically dominates China politically. Any questions about this? It's an interesting and very controversial point, of course. That's why I asked whether you had any questions, because it's much debated. In any case, that is part of the dynamics here. But there's one last point that I wish to make, which is asserting itself today, and that is, it was during the Vietnam War that part of the reason the United States lost the war was it began to suffer not only from social upheaval within, but also an economic crisis began to develop. People began to lose confidence in the American economy as a result of what was happening in Vietnam. And there was a run on the dollar. The dollar, people began to dump the US dollar because they lost confidence. Well, this ultimately, this problem in the immediate was dealt with, measures taken, but it manifested the growing weakness of the American economy. And these fundamental weaknesses were never really addressed by the US government. And these weaknesses persisted over the following decades. And today, the situation is a serious one. It was, in other words, I'm saying that the Vietnam War was the beginning of a long-term relative decline in American power, especially economic power. And this is now becoming a very, one of the key factors in world politics, the relative decline of the United States as an economic power. And of course, what we see is the United States reacting to that by becoming aggressive. It's trying to reassert its power. And we don't know the outcome of it. But what I'm saying is that the war did see the beginnings of these economic problems that they're dealing with today. Again, if you have questions about what I'm saying, please signal and just intervene with your voice and we can discuss it. So I would say, obviously, the Americans were fighting, of course, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but behind that was China, as is evident, and the Soviet Union as well. But also, and I made this point in the last lecture, Vietnam for the Americans was a testing ground, because while the Vietnam War was going on, there were upheavals in the third world. The third world, this was a Cold War. There was no hot war, a world war, but there were conflicts in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. And basically these conflicts were about the demands on the part of the major political movements in these third world countries to get clear of European and American colonialism and imperialism, the so-called revolt of the global South of the third world. And it really began with the Cuban Revolution of 1959, but it was spreading to many countries. And the United States wanted to demonstrate that it had the capacity, counterinsurgency capacity, to control and suppress these radical nationalist and communist movements in the third world, because commonly, not all, but most of them espoused the kind of third world Marxism. And so Vietnam, and the Americans didn't choose to make the main effort in Latin America, as you would probably expect. No, they decided to, on the doorstep of China, to demonstrate that they could suppress these insurgencies. So that was extremely important. But so having said that, nevertheless, it's the Chinese-American conflict, when you're talking about geopolitical conflict, which is very important. And partly it's important to the Americans for the following reason. All through the first part of the 20th century, the United States had been the main ally of China. This is really important. Vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Japan, the United States and the other powers, British, French, what have you, the Americans had been the supporters of the sovereignty and the independence of China. And the Americans acquired huge influence in China. The relationship was very strong. The United States acted differently from the other imperialist powers in defending Chinese sovereignty, and for which the Chinese were grateful. And when the Japanese, in particular, became more and more aggressive toward China, it was the United States who increasingly defended China against Japanese aggression. And they did this, and there was a certain altruism to this. Let me say that. It was a love relationship. I can only describe it, and you can see vestiges of this. For example, when I visited China a few years ago, one of the interesting things was I went to various universities to lecture, and you could see the influence of American universities on the American university became a kind of model for the Chinese universities. There was this ongoing intellectual, cultural connection between American people and Chinese people. So there was that. But of course, the United States did this. It wasn't all altruism, as you might expect, because first of all, they wanted to fend off the Japanese, but also the Americans saw China as a vast market for American capital and manufactured goods. If they could defeat Japan, China, with its 500 or 600 billion people, what a market! Do you realize how much Coca-Cola you could sell in China once all of the obstacles were cleared away? The Americans saw this as a vast market in the especially after World War II. However, China disappointed the United States of America because it made its own revolution. In 1949, the Chinese Revolution happened. And this is a huge shock to the United States. The United States lost China in 1949. Mao and the Chinese communists were victorious and established a Chinese republic based on socialism or communism. And so from that point onwards, the containment of China, and here we come, became the main goal of the United States, contain, and if you like, reabsorb China into the capitalist world. Well, how did they do this? Well, in 1950, the Korean War broke out, and the United States basically went to war against what they considered to be North Korean aggression. And in the course of the first year of the war, the Chinese intervened, and the Americans and the Chinese fought a war on Korean soil, 50 to 53, but also an economic embargo on China. The United States, which controlled the whole world economy, basically embargoed economically China. This is the overall context in which, again, when Vietnam seemed on the verge of falling to the communists, and at the back of them, the Chinese communists, the United States basically intervened full force in 1965 and fought this Vietnam War. So, having said all that, I just want to point out that one final aspect of this is that one of the dimensions of this conflict was the fact that the Soviet Union and China gave Vietnam enormous amounts of aid. Nothing to compare with what the Americans put into Vietnam, but nevertheless, extremely significant aid was forthcoming from these two powers. But China and the Soviet Union, as a matter of fact, were no longer allies. There was a split between Mao and the Russians that developed into a complete conflict in the course of the Vietnam War. So this was very important in international relations. But for the Vietnamese communists, they took advantage of this, and they both asked aid from the Soviet Union, they asked aid from the Chinese, and they were competing with one another, the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union, on who could aid Vietnam more strongly. And that helped the Vietnamese communists, is what I'm trying to say. That's another aspect of this that has to be borne in mind. Well, I've given you now, and this is the sort of the background, and I'll come back to it, the geopolitical background. It's the answer to the first question on your review. So you have to mention the ideological struggle, the development of the American presence in Asia through these different wars, the reasons why the United States became involved, containment of China, and also suppression of third world revolution. Those are the main. Those would be the highlights of an answer that you would develop in answering question one. Are there any questions about this? Okay, so having said all this, now we come to the basic thing. What about the Vietnamese? I haven't even mentioned them up to this point. But of course, the whole war was, and the Vietnamese, whether they were communists or they were anti-communists, they had their own agenda, and we have to really understand Vietnam in order to sort of fully grasp the significance of this war. Now, the thing is that Vietnam was an ancient country. It was an old country. It came into existence in the 11th century AD. In the 11th century, right in the heart of the Middle Ages in Europe, around about 1100, you have the consolidation of a Vietnamese monarchy. And the thing is that this entity, the imperial state of Vietnam, was modeled on the Chinese monarchy, the Chinese emperor, because the influence of China is right next door. They had been in a more or less ambiguous relationship. The Vietnamese both admired and were dependent on China, and they were also worried about being basically suppressed and absorbed by China. It was an ambiguous relationship, but from a cultural point of view and political point of view, Chinese influence was enormous on Vietnam. And the first thing is the fact that there was an emperor in Vietnam, just as there was in Beijing. There was an emperor in the Vietnamese capital. And there was an imperial court, and the whole imperial structure ran on the basis of a small class of intellectuals educated in the teachings of Confucius, constituted the Vietnamese bureaucracy. There were these Mandarin bureaucrats who executed the will of the emperor, and it was all based on the teachings of Confucius. Below this political level, there was the Mandarins were recruited from the landlord class, who were the dominant class in Vietnamese society. And of course, the middle class had no influence whatsoever. They were insignificant. There were a few towns. These merchants were lowly people. They had no influence whatsoever. And these landlords basically lived off the rents that were paid by the Vietnamese peasantry. And indeed, the taxes and the rents collected from the peasantry were the basis of both not only the power of the landlord class, but also the whole imperial structure was based on the work and the taxes of the common people, the peasantry. Now, in terms of ideology, the dominant ideology was Confucianism. However, alongside Confucianism, Buddhism, just as in China, was the most important religion in Vietnam. And there was, starting in the 17th century, a minority of Christians, Catholics in Vietnam. French missionaries in the late 17th century had missionized in Vietnam, and they converted about 10% of the population. So the majority were Buddhists. This plays a part, an important part in the war. The minority was about 10% Catholics who were very connected up with the French, really from the late 17th century onwards. And so that is also a factor. That gives you a basic sense of the setup in Vietnam, and it was carried over into the 20th century with some modification, what I've described. Certainly in the opening years of the 20th century, the characteristics that I've named, the emperor, the mandarins, the court, Confucianism, the landlord-peasant relationship, it was all still there. And these are factors in the war, as you'll see. Now, I want to now talk about how the French got involved in Vietnam. It came about as a result of a huge humiliation that the French suffered in Europe. But before I deal with that, I want to define my terms. I have been talking about imperialism and colonialism. I want to talk a little bit about what is imperialism and how colonialism fits into this. Now, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking in more general terms. We're not simply speaking about the French. The French certainly were characterized by imperialism and colonialism, but so too the British, the Germans, the Belgians, and in a certain sense, the United States of America as well. So what was imperialism? Well, I'm giving you the classic definition of imperialism. First of all, imperialism is linked with what we call the monopoly stage of capitalism. Monopoly capitalism is the first characteristic. That is to say, the heights of the economy of most of the European powers and the United States, the economies of these countries, obviously all of them were capitalist, but they had evolved over 100 years into what we call monopoly capitalism. That is to say, a few big companies and banks came to dominate the economies of all of these European and the United States economy at the end of the 19th century. That was number one. The second was, so you have big business dominating the economy, but big business, in order to function, was entering into closer and closer relations with the state. There was, in fact, a fusion of the state with the monopoly capital at the end of the 19th century. In other words, the politicians who controlled each of one of these states had close connections with the big business people, the bankers and the big industrialists. And they together worked out the internal economic policies, but also the foreign policies of these different countries that I've been speaking about. The main thing, and so far as big business was, one of the things that the big business required the internal market in most of these countries, whether it was the United States or it was Britain or it was Germany, was no longer sufficient. These economies had grown so large that they couldn't operate simply on a national basis. They needed to operate internationally, and they needed the support of the state in order to do so. And so the main thing was they needed investment opportunities. They had surplus capital, and they needed areas where they could invest their capital. Of course, they needed markets for their manufactured goods. They needed raw materials, but above all, they needed investment opportunities, places where they could invest in things like railways and make profits out of investing in foreign countries. So the export of capital becomes very important. And so finally, in order to do this, what we see is the development in this concluding decades of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, of colonialism. Colonialism develops. That is to say, what thereafter, that is to say, what the imperialist structure of each of these countries, including France, is they're looking for investments, they're looking for investment opportunities, they're looking for markets for their manufactured goods, they're looking for raw materials, they're looking for cheap labor, and so they try to establish closed markets in as many third world countries as they can. And this is the so-called famous race for colonies of the late 19th and early 20th century, which the United States was involved in. We saw they took the Philippines, they took Cuba, they took Hawaii, they took Guam. They began to grow, gain influence in Latin America, and so on. Now, what about the French case? I said the French were driven by humiliation. What do I mean? France had been the great power on the continent of Europe since the 17th century and the days of Louis XIV. And France continued to be the dominant power in Europe right through the 18th and much of the 19th century. And they had this long tradition of proud military imperial history. But lo and behold, a rival developed. Can anybody tell me what the name of the rival was? Starting in the middle of the 19th century. Who was the rival? Germany, right. Garrett answers the question. Germany was the rival. It was actually Prussia, which was the most powerful, most industrialized state. Well, it came to war in 1870. The German army, led by Prussia, humiliated the French, and France lost its status as the great power on the continent of Europe. Germany replaced it. They were humiliated, and they never forgot this defeat, the Germans, the French. Added to which, in the immediate wake of this defeat, there was an attempted socialist revolution in France. Can anybody tell me the name of this revolution in France? What was the name of there was a revolution in the city of Paris. Actually, it's the first socialist revolution in history. Is anybody, the Paris Commune, says Nolan. Exactly. The Parisians rose up and overthrew the then government in France and tried to establish a socialist government, which terrified people of property in France. So you have the combination of the Paris Commune and the defeat inflicted by Germany. France was humiliated, the leadership and so on. And the way they basically, the idea was, well, we've lost our national prestige. Business has lost confidence. And so what do we do? Well, we look to imperialism and colonialism in order to compensate for our losses. And so France embarked, alongside, of course, many other European powers, on the route of imperialism and colonialism. And of course, what we see is they seized virtually the whole of North Africa, became a French colony. West Africa became a French colony, still is. These states are independent in French West Africa, nominally. The reality is that France pulls the strings. French West Africa is under French control. And they conquered Indochina, including Vietnam. That's basically what happened. And this happened in the first instance. The French conquered, sorry, I have the date wrong, it's 1858 and 1997. Can you see the screen? I think you can. The conquest of Indochina, including Vietnam, occurred between 1858 and 1897. Sorry, again, I didn't see that. 1897. Over roughly 40, 50 years, in step by step, they took more and more of Vietnam, and also they occupied the neighboring states of Laos and Cambodia were taken by the French. And their mission, obviously, they were seeking economic advantage. One of the ways they had this figured is if they could take Indochina, it would be a way of moving also into southern China proper. They could penetrate from Indochina up into China, southern China as well. That was certainly the motive, but also I would say they also had this idea that their manufacturers could sell their goods, particularly their textiles, into Indochina. There was an economic motive. Thirdly, they were protecting they said they were protecting the Catholic minority against depredations by the Buddhists. And finally, they were bringing civilization to Vietnam. The civilizing mission, la mission civilisatrice. Civilization was European, and particularly French civilization. We have another example of that. We have 3 minutes left. There's another country that had the same idea of bringing civilization. Well, I'll name that country. It was England. What did they call, the English call, their bringing civilization to the third world? What was the name that they gave to their civilizing mission? Anybody know? Anybody know? It was called the white man's burden. The poor, that is to say, the Europeans were bringing civilization. That was the burden that destiny had given to the Europeans, especially to the British and the French. They were bringing civilization to the rest of the world. They didn't recognize that the rest of the world, even China, or let alone Vietnam, with its 1,000-year-old history, the Chinese has a history that goes back 2000 BC. They didn't recognize these countries as civilized, to say nothing of Latin America with its pre-Columbian civilizations or African civilizations. The only civilization was European civilization. It was a racial thing. They did basically by 1897, there was a last great uprising between 1885 and 1897. As a matter of fact, the Mandarins, they put up a fierce resistance between 1885 and 1897, but they could do nothing against French cannon and repeating rifles. And by 1897, the French put a puppet on the throne of Vietnam, and they fully occupied the country. So it's at this point that, so the period of conquest is between 1858 and 1897. The next period, 1897 to 1925, I would describe as the establishment of the French colonialism in Vietnam, and we'll deal with that in the next class.
Could I ask a really quick question?
Yes,
What was at the very end? You said it was 1897 and 1925 was the French
Yes.
establishment of what?
the French colonial system. We're going to start next time with that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll ask for questions next time.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind.
No, I don't.
Would you recommend with starting any of the 4 books in particular first for the paper?
I think you should start with the most conventional, which is the McNamara book. The most conventional. It gives you the official American perspective.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.